Hey everybody, welcome to Parker Hill Church Online. I'm so glad you've taken the time to join us for these few minutes as we reconnect with the heart of God and recalibrate our minds with His truth. And my hope and my prayer is that God will meet you wherever you are right now and speak to you in a very personal and a very powerful way. And if you're watching this message by yourself, let me just encourage you to invite a few other people to join you next time and create what we call a watch party, which is where you watch the service together, talk about it, and maybe even enjoy a meal together. We have a page on our website that explains how to host your own watch parties, so check that out, find your people, and be the church wherever you are. Well, throughout the summer, we're going through this teaching series called Faith Works. And during this series, we're just walking our way through one book of the Bible, the letter of James. And James was the leader of the church in Jerusalem, which of course was where the church started in the first century. And he wrote this letter to first century Christians who had been scattered from Jerusalem around the world by persecution. And there's a theme that's woven throughout this letter. It's the idea that real faith works. That real faith is not just something that's in your head, it's also in your life. It's not just a matter of what we believe, it's also a matter of how we behave. And today, we're talking about how to have healthy relationships and how to navigate conflict in a constructive way within those relationships. Now, let me tell you why this is so important for us to get right. Those of us who are believers, those of us who are followers of Christ, we have been given a mission. We are ambassadors of another kingdom, an eternal kingdom, and our calling is to share the hope of the gospel with a world that desperately needs it. And if we don't know how to build healthy relationships, and if we don't know how to communicate in a healthy way, then we will be completely ineffective in our calling and maybe even counterproductive. And I'll tell you what, every week I've been amazed at how each passage in this letter from James has been so relevant to current events, and the same is true today. I mean, these words that were written to Christians almost 2,000 years ago are words that we really need to hear in this world right now that is so divided and so angry. Let me read the passage for you, and then we'll unpack it together. This is James chapter 3, beginning in verse 13. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." Now, you may have noticed that the word wise or wisdom comes up 4 times in this brief passage. And so we're talking today about how to have wisdom in the realm of our relationships. And there's one idea that I hope will become crystal clear over the next few minutes. It's this simple idea: the wise person is a peacemaker and not just a point maker. The wise person, and I want to be one, I hope you do too, the wise person is a peacemaker, not just a point maker. And here's what I mean by that. You can be absolutely right about something and be absolutely wrong in the way that you communicate it and end up alienating other people. You can win the argument but lose the relationship. And I see this happen all the time in marriages, between parents and kids. I see it in churches. I even see it in the way that we sometimes engage our culture, the way that we as Christians debate the issues of our day. See, it's not enough to be right. We need to be right in the right way. We need to learn to make a point without making enemies and losing our audience completely, because we are called to be peacemakers, not just point makers. All right, let's dig into this passage. I'll pick up again here in verse 13. It begins this way: "Who is wise and understanding among you?" In other words, those of you who think you have all the answers, those of you who think you've got this Christianity thing figured out, those of you who believe that you are the spiritual leaders, here's how you can prove it. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life. In other words, real wisdom isn't just a matter of knowing the right things. It's about living the right way. And we all know people who did great on their SATs, right? But they do very, very poorly when it comes to life. Because there's a big difference between knowledge and wisdom. And I've known a lot of Christians who possessed incredible amounts of Bible knowledge. And from a distance, they seem to be really wise and understanding. But then when you get up close to them and get to know them, they're just downright unpleasant people. And they have all kinds of broken relationships in their lives, and it's not because they lack knowledge. It's because they lack wisdom. And when it comes to having wisdom in our relationships, there's one word here in the passage that's absolutely fundamental, one word that describes how we show wisdom in the context of our relationships. Verse 13, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the what? In the humility that comes from wisdom. And that's a key word. It really is, because humility is so important in relationships, because pride is poison to any relationship. In fact, let me ask you a question. How many of you love to be around somebody who has an ego problem? Like nobody, right? Because we appreciate humility. Pride poisons relationships. Humility is the key to good relationships. Now, in the rest of this passage, James goes on to describe a clear contrast between two kinds of wisdom and then two different kinds of results that are produced by those two kinds of wisdom. Okay? So picking up in verse 14, he says, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom, in quotes, does not come down from heaven, but it is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Let me focus in on that sentence in verse 15 there in the middle. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is, three words here, earthly. In other words, based on a value system that recognizes nothing eternal, it looks no further than human opinion. This wisdom, quote unquote, is also unspiritual. It's based on a value system that doesn't recognize the existence of God or a divine perspective. And then the third word here, it's demonic. Like, we can believe that we are wise, and the world around us can tell us that we are wise, when in fact, our thinking is really being shaped by hell itself. And James says there's a kind of wisdom that's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. And if our minds are rooted in that kind of wisdom, we're eventually going to see the results in our words, in our lives, in our behavior. My daughter was young. We did a science project with some flowers, and so I tried to recreate it this week. You can put different flowers in different containers and add food coloring to the water. Like this one, I added blue food coloring. And what happens is as evaporation takes place in the flower petals, it draws up more water. And because the water that's coming up is tainted with blue food coloring, it will eventually make the flower the same color. And you can just see the beginnings of it here, just starting to get blue. And if I leave it in here long enough, the flowers will absorb the color in the water that they're placed in. And I think the same thing happens to us. The values we absorb will change the way we look and the way we live. And when you drink deeply from the wisdom that is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic, here's what will happen over time. Two things will begin to define you. They're in verse 14, bitter envy and selfish ambition. Bitter envy, that's about, the other person, when I'm sad about your success and delighted by your failure. Selfish ambition is the other side of the coin. That's about me being consumed with my life and my agenda and my needs and my plans. Bitter envy and selfish ambition will destroy any relationship. When you've got two people in a relationship who always demand their own way, two people who refuse to give in, that relationship will not last. Let me quote again this week from one of my favorite theologians, Dr. Seuss. Do you remember the story about the Zacks? Here's how it goes. The north-going Zacks and the south-going Zacks were both making tracks in the prairie of Prax. And it happened that both of them came to a place where they bumped. There they stood, foot to foot, face to face. Then the north-going Zacks puffed his chest up with pride. I never, he said, take a step to one side. And I'll prove to you that I won't change my ways if I have to keep standing here 59 days. And I'll prove to you, yelled the South-going Zacks, that I can stand here in the Prairie of Prax for 59 years. For I live by a rule that I learned as a boy back in South-going school. Never budge, that's my rule. Never budge in the least. Not an inch to the west, not an inch to the east. And then in the very last scene in the book, they're shown still standing there as a highway has been built around them. I love that story, but that's not just a Dr. Seuss story. See, I've seen that in real life. That's a picture of some marriages right now. There are marriages that fall apart because the husband or wife of both of them has to win every argument, make every decision. I mean, that's a picture of some friendships right now. There are long-term friendships that dissolve into pieces because one or both people refuse to admit they were wrong. I mean, that's a picture of politics in 2020, right? See, when we soak up the wisdom of the world, our lives will be driven by envy and selfish ambition. And then here is the ultimate result of that. It goes on to say in verse 16, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Listen, if you wonder why we're seeing so much anger and conflict and division and chaos in our culture right now, here's why. It's because we as a nation are no longer rooted in anything eternal. Our thinking is rooted in the messages we hear every day from our culture, a kind of wisdom that is earthly and unspiritual and demonic, which always leads eventually to what James is describing here 2,000 years ago, disorder and every evil practice. But then, verse 17, James goes on to describe a very different kind of wisdom with a very different kind of outcome. I'll pick up here in verse 17. It begins with the word but. In other words, here's a contrast. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, and sincere. Do you see the contrast there? There's a wisdom that's earthly and unspiritual and demonic, and then there's this kind of wisdom, the wisdom that comes from heaven. And in order to have wisdom in our relationships, we got to start looking in the right place. We need to drink deeply from the truth of Scripture. We need to sink our roots into the mind and heart of God through worship and through prayer. And when we do that, it'll change the way we think, and then we'll change the way we speak and the way we navigate relationships. Now, if you keep reading here, you're going to see 7 words and phrases that describe this wisdom that comes from heaven. And as I talk about each one of them briefly, let me just encourage you as you're hearing this to do some self-assessment and evaluate where you might need to do some work, okay? First of all, but the wisdom that comes from heaven is, first of all, pure. Now, when you hear that word, well, we often think of as moral purity, but quite often in the Bible, the word purity means purity of heart. In fact, you may remember Jesus in the Beatitudes said, "Blessed are the pure in heart." And do you know it's possible for us to have impure motives as we relate to other people? We can approach a relationship with the attitude that says, how can I use this person to get what I want out of life? To be pure means that we care about people for who they are and not whether or not they can do something to advance our agenda. So the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, and then here's the second attribute of this heavenly wisdom. It is peace-loving. Peace-loving. Now, let me begin by telling you what it doesn't mean to be a peace-loving person. Okay, being peace-loving does not mean that you pursue peace at any price. It doesn't mean that you compromise truth just to avoid any conflict. No, being peace-loving doesn't mean that you never have an opinion of your own. Peace lovers are people who do this, who put such a high value on relationships that they will go out of their way, not to avoid conflict, but to resolve conflict. Being a peacemaker means being like Jesus because he came to be a peacemaker, right? He made peace between me and God and did that by giving his own life. He was willing to pay the highest possible price on a cross to make peace. And peace-loving people are people who are willing to do whatever it takes to have the hard conversation, to do the difficult thing, to say the difficult thing, to pursue that person, to repair that relationship. But let me give you a dose of reality here. We can't always be at peace with everyone. In fact, listen to these very important words from Romans chapter 12, where the Apostle Paul says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I love how realistic that is. See, the fact of the matter is there will be people in your life that won't let you be at peace with them. But here's the key. If there's not going to be peace, make sure it's their decision and not your lack of wisdom. Okay, here's the third attribute of this heavenly wisdom. It is, first of all, pure. It is peace-loving. Number 3, it is considerate. Considerate. Some translations of the Bible use the word gentle. And what this means is that when you deal with people, you consider their value as a human being. You deal with people in a way that's gentle and not harsh. Charles Swindoll, a pastor and an author, in one of his books tells a great story about this. He says, years ago, I used to sell shoes. My seasoned employer, with a twinkle in his eye, instructed me never to say, lady, your foot is too big for this shoe. I was taught to say instead, I'm sorry, but this shoe is just a little too small for your foot. He says both statements expressed the facts, but one was insulting while the other was tactful. See, here's the thing. How you say what you say is just as important as what you say. And what you say to someone else may be 100% true, but if it isn't said in the right way, with the right tone, at the right time, then your great truth may never be heard. But when we speak truth in a loving, humble, gracious, gentle way, then people might actually listen to us. Here's the fourth attribute of this wisdom that comes from heaven. It's first of all pure, then peace-loving, then considerate. And the next word is this, the word submissive. Submissive. Now, some translations of the Bible use the phrase open to reason. Open to reason. To be open to reason means that you're willing to listen, that you're willing to receive input from someone else. It means that you're willing, when necessary, to admit that you're wrong. Wise people are open to reason. They are submissive. They are teachable. You know, years ago when the church was smaller, I used to do some marriage counseling. And at the beginning of a conversation with a couple, you always want to try to understand the issues. And so I would often begin by saying, okay, tell me what's going on. And almost every time the conversation would go something like this. The reason we're having so many problems is because my husband does this. Or the reason we're having all these problems is because my wife never does this. And it just goes back and forth like that. So I heard this idea a few years ago and I started using it. I get a piece of paper and I draw a circle on it like this. And then I say something like this. This circle represents all the problems in your marriage. All the problems in your marriage, just imagine them being in this circle. And then I give a pen to the husband or wife and I say, now, I want you to draw a slice of the pie that you think represents your responsibility for the problems in this marriage. In other words, what slice of the pie is your fault? Now, the few times I've done this, nobody has ever done this, okay? Nobody does that. Usually it looks a little bit more like something like that, okay? Like, here's my piece and here's their piece. And then I say, okay, so let's you and I just talk about just this, okay? Let's talk about this piece that you would say is your responsibility. Let's talk about your slice of the pie, that 20%. You know what? It is tremendously difficult to get anybody to stay on his or her slice of the pie. When the other person is 80% wrong, the natural thing to do is to focus on what you believe is their 80%, right? But I think that maybe the wise thing to do is to start by owning up to your own 20%, because that is being submissive, that's being teachable, that's being open to reason, and that's wisdom that comes from heaven. Wisdom that comes from heaven is pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive. And here's the fifth attribute of this wisdom that comes from heaven. It's full of mercy, full of mercy. When another person has hurt you, has failed you, has just really blown it, here's my question. Are you willing to show them mercy? Are you a peacemaker, or are you just a point maker? You know, years ago, I read a book by Leonard Sweet. It was called Out of the Question. And in this book, the author tells a story about a friend of his, a guy named Tim, who had a brand new Ford pickup truck, and his truck got damaged by his neighbor. And here's how the story goes. Here's what he writes in the book. He says, as I climbed into his new truck, I saw two big scrapes by the passenger door. What happened here? I asked. My neighbor's basketball post fell and left those dents, he replied in a downcast voice. You're kidding. How awful, I commiserated. This truck is so new I can smell it. What's even worse is my neighbor doesn't feel responsible for the damage, he said. Rising to my friend's defense, I said, did you contact your insurance company? How are you going to get him to pay for it? This has been a real spiritual journey for me, Tim replied. After a lot of soul searching and discussions with my wife about hiring an attorney, it came down to this. I can either be in the right or I can be in a relationship with my neighbor. Since my neighbor will probably be with me longer than this truck, I decided that I'd rather be in a relationship than be right. Besides, trucks are meant to be banged up, so I got mine initiated into the real world a little bit earlier than I expected. And in reading that, I was just captured by that phrase. I decided that I'd rather be in a relationship than be right. And that's wisdom. I believe wisdom is choosing to show mercy when we have every right to demand justice. Now listen, if you're a believer, if you're a follower of Christ, think about it. That's exactly what God has shown you and me. He has shown us mercy. And he simply calls us to extend that same mercy to others. There may be somebody watching this service today and your spouse has blown it. They have failed you in some significant way, but you won't let it go. And you want them to keep paying the price for that. And in the process, you may be destroying that relationship. There may be some parents watching today, and you have a child who really hurt you, and they've done some things that just broke your heart, and you're just having a hard time letting go of that hurt and letting them have a new start. You may lose that relationship. The wise person is the person who treats other people the way that he hopes God will treat him, with mercy. Okay, number 6, the sixth attribute when it comes to this heavenly wisdom is being impartial. And what this means is pretty obvious. It means that you treat all people the same. You treat all people fairly. We show the same respect to the poor and the forgotten as we do to the rich and powerful. And we show the same respect to people on the other side of a political debate as we do the people in our own tribe. Okay, one more. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, and here it is, number 7, sincere. And sincere just means being open and authentic. It means not holding back when something does need to be said. The wise person is a peacemaker, but being a peacemaker does not mean that we compromise the truth just to avoid a conflict. We are sincere and we are honest even when it's difficult. We speak the truth. It's just that we do it in a spirit of humility. So those are the qualities of the wisdom that comes from heaven. Pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, impartial, and sincere. And here's the result of living by that kind of wisdom. Verse 18 sums it all up. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. How many of you would like to see your life produce a harvest of righteousness? I mean, if you're a follower of Christ, you want that, don't you? And I believe our lives will produce a harvest of righteousness when we learn to be peacemakers and not just point makers. Now imagine what this could look like. Imagine what would happen if every married person could learn to deal with conflict according to heavenly wisdom. Think about how that would change our families. What if every parent could learn how to deal with their kids according to heavenly wisdom, to speak hard truth without alienating them, and in the process passing on our faith and our values to the next generation? What if all the Christians in our culture could learn how to love the people of this world instead of just trying to argue with them? Man, I think we could change the world, or at least our little corner of the world here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So as you think about this message in this passage, if you're watching this message with a group of people right now, I want you to take a few minutes after I'm done to just talk about this. Here are a few discussion questions. Number one is this. Number one, in what ways do we allow the wisdom, in what way do we allow ourselves to be influenced by wisdom that is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic? In other words, what are those influences that we allow into our minds that shape us in the wrong way? And how do we stay engaged in our world without totally immersing our hearts and minds in those messages of that wisdom that just isn't the right kind of wisdom? And the second question is this: as you think through this description of heavenly wisdom, which of those 7 attributes do you struggle with the most? Okay, a little honesty on that question. And number 3, what steps can we take to love the people around us who may have a different worldview? I mean, take it outside of the context of your family and think about our mission as a church. Because here's the biggest reason why we need to be peacemakers. Because we are followers of the one who is the ultimate peacemaker. He came to turn us from enemies of God into the sons and daughters of God. And he was willing to go to a cross to restore that relationship. Colossians chapter 1 says it this way, so powerfully, so beautifully. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. The cross is the place where peace was made for you and me. And as Christians, we follow the example of the ultimate peacemaker. Great to have you guys with us today. I've got a special message planned for next weekend as we celebrate the 4th of July, our Independence Day as a nation. Right now, stay with us as Kyle comes to close our time together. Good to have you with us again this week online.